I'm here.
Councilmember Austin Lane. Here. Councilmember Barry. Here. Councilmember Clay. Here. Councilmember Elrich. Councilmember Siemens.
Present.
Councilmember Williams.
Here.
Are there any council comments or announcements? Anyone have a comment? Terry?
Thank you, Mayor Porter. I'm curious if anyone knows what the regulations are regarding voting machines and the security of those machines, because I just came from the Tacoma Park Recreation Center on New Hampshire Avenue, and the voting machines for that precinct are sitting out in the weight room over there, the workout room, and without any election official there. And I wondered if that's, if anyone knows if that's okay. I guess the question comes up to my mind, given the concern that we've had over the electronic machines, and access to those machines has been a concern. And some of the reports, such as the one out of Princeton University, say that access of less than a minute can allow someone to hack into the computer on those machines and maybe alter the votes. And I just wondered if there's regulations that require those machines to be locked away prior to election.
I think certainly, regardless of the regulations, I think this would be a good thing for us to bring to the attention of the Board of Elections. I don't know what the regulations are, but certainly we can do that and make sure that they know that. They're probably not there at this point, but make sure they know first thing in the morning that you did notice that they were in a place that was available or accessible to the public.
Right. They are accessible. They look like they have some kind of seal on them, but I thought it was unusual for them to be in an unsecured location.
Okay. Is there anything else? Any other comments or announcements?
I just encourage everyone to vote tomorrow. Looking forward to hopefully a very positive outcome for our state and country.
Of course, others might have their own definition of positive outcome. I know what mine is, and I suspect I know what yours is, but I hope it comes out the way I want it to, and I assume we all do. But anyone else?
Yes. We'd just like to recognize this letter, from the governor to you, Mayor Porter, dated November the 1st, indicating that the city will receive $38,000 in Community Legacy Program money to be channeled to the New Hampshire Avenue Corridor Initiative redevelopment. So that's the first bit of real money coming from the state. I'm sure there will be more in the months ahead, and a very vigorous, well thought out plan is going forward, and it's certainly good to see that we've managed to attract this money, and so thanks to the staff for putting in for this program and being successful in this round. Great.
And I also wanted to note that we have been reauthorized, or whatever the word is, for the Chesapeake Bay Partner Program at the gold level, which is something that we've done before, and is a program that's administered in conjunction with the local government. I'm going to not get the name quite right, but the local government members of the Chesapeake Bay. It's a very long. No. It's the compact group. Is that correct?
Yes, you're right. It does have a very long name, but there is a group of member municipalities and states, Virginia, D.C., and Maryland, that work together to protect the Chesapeake Bay in Pennsylvania. And we went through a fairly exhaustive application process a number of years ago, and it's been renewed, and we're pleased with that.
Yes. Thank you for filling that in. I don't have anything else, so we will go on to adoption of minutes. We have in front of us the minutes of September 18th, September 25th, and October 3rd.
Move their approval.
Second.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded. All those in favor of approving the minutes, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? Minutes are approved. The next item on the agenda is the public comment period. This is the time on the council's agenda that's set aside for comments on items that are not on our special session agenda. The only item on our special session is a discussion of the Willow Avenue speed humps. So comments on any other item, including work session items or anything else you'd like to bring before the council, would be appropriate at this point. I would ask when you come up to the council that you identify yourself and that you keep your comments brief.
Yeah. My name's Pat Lovelace, 7620 Maple Avenue.
That's just me, Pat, sorry. Go ahead.
7620 Maple Avenue in Tacoma Park. Now, we know tomorrow is Election Day, and I hope everybody can come out and vote, and I hope that everybody can remind all their friends to come out and vote. But one thing that's been brought to my attention more than once is when people go into the building to vote, some people are saying that some people from the press had hounded them, saying, who are you voting for, and follow them into the building. It would be nice if they had a sign, saying, no hounding the voters beyond this point, or no press beyond this point, if it is press, I'm not sure. But one of the ladies who mentioned it to me said that she thought her vote was between her and her God, and that's all. And she thinks voting is a very private thing, even more private than going to the bathroom. And she feels just as embarrassed and humiliated when somebody walks in and says, who are you voting for all the time? And she said it's not the first time it's happened. And if that could be addressed tomorrow so that I can let people know that they got nothing to worry about, it'd be great. And also tomorrow we have a chance to make our country much better, our state much better, and everything else. And if we can get at least tell one person to tell 10 more people to go and vote, and then they can tell 10 more people, we might be able to get a lot more people out there to vote no matter what the weather is. And I'll be down there at the middle school tomorrow, Piney Branch Middle School, I believe the name of it is. I'll be down there in the wheelchair cheering on the voters, and I'll be down there at the polls all day tomorrow, have the big peace sign out and everything, and doing what we can do to make my country a lot better and a lot safer and a lot more what more we want. But if people do not vote, then they cannot complain if they don't get what they want. Like if we want an end to the war, we got to vote for it. We want to have decent people in politics, we got to vote for it. We want to have some nice people like Jamie and all these other nice people like Terry in there. We got to vote for it. Our vote counts. And then after we get the people in, we got to help back them up by coming to meetings and stuff, by learning about our government, by actively taking part in our government, by being active, like Tacoma Park is famous for. But the main thing you got to do is start by getting up off your keister and getting out there and voting. That's the first step right there. And then come in and help your elected officials do what you want, because they cannot always guess what you want. Thank you for letting me share.
Thank you, Pat.
The main thing is the pounding of the voters as they go into the voting chambers. That has to stop. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. I would note that on the news this evening, they said that the governor's race and the race for Senate were both too close to call. So I would reiterate your call for people to get out and vote. I think it's going to be an extremely important election.
It's an exciting time. This race was a very exciting one.
Yes. Thank you,
They'll
Pat.
enjoy it when they take part in it. Thank you for letting me share.
Okay. All right. Erwin Mack, Executive Director, Tacoma Langley Crossroad. Mayor and Council, I breathed a sigh of relief some months ago when we passed the peddler and food vendors ordinance, only to discover to my chagrin that the best minds that you have to offer, including mine, failed to anticipate the shrewdness of some other people. And tonight you're going to consider what to do about those people who are good people, but who may not be doing what we wish they wouldn't do in places that they're doing it. We're talking about the location and the type of vendors that are going to be considered. In particular, the uniqueness of the challenge is that Tacoma Park obviously is bordered by several other jurisdictions. And in particular, the one that you have pictures of and the letter addresses happens to be on Carroll Avenue, where on one side of the street is Montgomery County and the other side of the street is Tacoma Park. But that's no different than it is at the crossroads, where one side of the street is Prince George's County and the other side of the street is Tacoma Park. And laws and ordinances are different on opposite sides of the street. The day in particular that I took those pictures and wrote the letter happened to be following a previous weekend when there was either a flea market or a group of people in front of the former, what is now the Spanish Church, and the medical building on Montgomery side, having either sales or flea market, as well as the one at the Shell station. And two different jurisdictions had different approaches to what was going to be taken there. I appreciate particularly Acting Chief Police Ed Corsi's involvement in this, and Councilmember Doug Barry, as we looked at what to do about this and trying to keep blight out of the city. This is going to be a challenge, particularly after reading what the attorney is recommending to the city to consider. We have the same problem in the Papusa wagon situation, which District 2, Prince George's Council member Will Campus is working on resolving by limiting the number of Papusa wagons to 8, 2 in each of 4 locations. But all those locations will not be on a main stream. They'll be on a street where they can be accessed by those people who wish to use their services, but not where the general public might be having their view infringed on. So I would encourage that the study that's given not deny people the right to do things that are legitimate, but neither should the minority infringe their views on the majority who might not appreciate what they're doing. To some degree, it's ironic that since this has come up, the construction at the corner of University and Carroll has narrowed down the ground space that's available. And one of the recommendations talking about setbacks on here could very well take care of the problem of what might happen on that green space, because it's going to be a much nicer intersection as a result.
Can you summarize?
Yes. My point being that I'd be pleased to work with whatever group you recommend this be turned over to, so that we can look at how not to infringe on people's rights, but also to protect people from aesthetic blight.
Thank you. We appreciate
Mr. Mack, I wonder if I could ask you a question. You said that Montgomery County handled the flea market differently than what Tacoma Park has handled things. What did you mean by that?
Well, it required a different group of people to go out and look into the blight that we called it there, and they simply said you can't do that. And then, in addition, I meant to mention that I talked with the pastor of the church and the principal of the school and suggested gently that this might not be an appropriate location to allow these things to consider, and since that time they have no longer allowed people to be on their private property. Because it's really on the Shell station we're talking about private property, and in the Montgomery County situation, they just simply went out and said this is not appropriate, and then the owners agreed. Whereas in the investigation that Chief Corsi made, he found satisfactory letters from the purported property owners permitting this to take place.
Okay, so the difference was not in the government jurisdiction, but it was really the difference in the attitude of the owners.
To a great degree, yes.
Property owners, okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
David Bates, 46 Philadelphia Avenue. I'm going to ask first if you forgive me because I'm bringing something to your attention that I don't think is the city's responsibility. But I'm going to ask for your help tonight because I think it's extremely important. We have a nice gym, even though this one hasn't been built on top of us. We have a nice gym sitting over there on New Hampshire Avenue. It's quite busy, has a lot of people right now. There's a jazzercise class going, and there's a weight room full of people lifting weights, and I was one of them. And I was really startled to discover this evening that there is a stack of voting machines, unsecured, sitting inside the weight room in the entrance. They are not locked up. They are not in any way, shape, or form even being looked over. Now, I know this is not a city responsibility. It is on city property, and I was wondering if maybe, at least for this evening, some authority of the city might be able to lock those up and put them under key. And I would also suggest, if anyone has any interest in joining me, I intend to file a complaint with this county's Board of Elections because I don't know how they could have let those things sit there without being watched. So I don't know if the police have any possible responsibility to lock those up, if that could be done.
Councilmember Siemens had brought this up previously, and we were going to notify the Board of Elections first thing in the morning.
Can they be locked up tonight, now? There are people going in and out. I mean, I was there lifting, and there are people with, 50, 60-pound dumbbells. It's near the dumbbell rack. If anything gets hit, the machines could be miscounting or it could malfunction. I mean, they're right literally there in the doorway by the dumbbells racks. That's just unacceptable, and it's not your responsibility, but if you can help get those things locked up, it would be tremendously appreciated.
We'll see what we can do. I guess I have two comments. One is I know that the Board of Elections delivered them to that location today.
Yeah, they're not answering their phone. I tried.
And the second thing is I'm not sure if they're, we'll see what we can do, but I also don't want to
Lock
put
the
them,
election
lock them up
judges
in
out,
some place
yeah.
that is, then the Board of Elections doesn't have access to, and I'll
Like I say, it's
double-check.
not your responsibility. I'm just asking for help because it's absolutely unacceptable, especially when they're questioning some of the electronic balloting that's going on. Even if somebody doesn't want to tamper with them, they might hit the suckers with a piece of steel.
That's not my voting location, although I've done, poll watching there. So I don't know whether they're usually in the weight room or not, but certainly we should.
No, they would be in the gymnasium, but they're, again, on
Yeah.
a four-wheel cart, and they pushed them out of the way. But, with as many people going in and out right now,
Yeah.
if anybody wanted to do something, it calls into question the veracity of any vote that comes out of those machines. And it's not your problem, I know, but it's all of our problem.
Colleen?
I happened to have a conversation with someone, someone from it's one of the election judges earlier today, and they told me that from 7 to 9 tonight, they were going to all of the locations and unpacking all the equipment and doing an equipment check tonight and making sure they had all the proper cards and all that kind of thing. So I would think that was happening at all of the locations. They'd have to have access to it until 9 o'clock.
Well, I was there up until 7 o'clock. And
I'm just telling you,
yeah.
She said from 7 to 9, they were doing a check. It was one of the new things that they were doing. I don't have any other knowledge.
Well, any citizens that are intending to vote over there, I would call into question whatever the results are. They really ought to raise Cain about that.
I did also
Thank
check
you for
with,
bringing that up.
yeah, I did also check with the city employee who's working over there now, and they said that, the intention is to lock the building up at 10:30 when the center closes, so from that point on, at least it will be locked within the building. And all I can tell you is I did observe that tonight, and that there were no election officials there in the room or within sight of the voting
No,
machines.
it's at one end of the building. I had full access to the machines myself. I mean, it's pathetic. Anyway, that's all.
That's scary.
Well, thank you, David, for bringing that to our attention.
If you're a fan of a return to paper ballots, as I am, you would conclude that the only reasonable public purpose for an electronic voting machine would be for doing bench presses.
Hi, I'm Catherine Tunis, Chair of the Committee on the Environment, and I wanted to comment just a little bit on the discussion that you'll be having later in work session about city committees, operation of general city committees. I did send an email last night. I didn't know about this until I got my agenda over the weekend, so I did send an email to the council members late last night with some of my initial thoughts. We have discussed a lot of the issues that were in my email among the committee, generally among the senior committee members. The newer committee members may not be as aware of them. But one of the things I wanted to point out that I think is for council members to keep in mind is the structure of the relationship of the committees to council and the city manager and staff to council. And I think that much of the other kinds of structural things that people need to work out, whatever procedures get worked out, need to keep that in mind, that I see council as the ultimate responsible authority. Obviously, they're responsible to the voters. But they're the ones who are responsible, and the committees I see as advisory bodies as adjunct to the council. The staff, the city manager and staff, I see off on the other side that they obviously are employees and that they have a direct line of authority on up to the council. I think that clearly in many of the projects that our committee would work on, we would want to work jointly with staff and then hopefully bring, whatever results we're able to find to council. But not everything that we do is a joint committee staff project. And so I think that we need to be very careful about potential conflict of interest, potential and actual conflict of interest in the relationships, and that there's opportunity for committees to work on their own without direct oversight of staff. I mean, the staff should never, ever be directing the committees what they do, what they don't do, what topics they discuss, what topics they don't discuss. And I see that, I see this, I guess, so strongly myself because as a federal employee, we need to deal with industry, with citizens, with contractors, with grantees, and every one of those relationships is different, and we need to make sure that we keep in mind how we deal with things. And I think, though I'm not the only person on our committee who has concerns about this, and I would imagine that others in other committees do as well, that we need to be very careful about how that relationship is structured and how those roles are clarified. Thank you.
Thank you. As you know, we will be discussing that as our first work session item, and you and anyone else is welcome to stay for that discussion. Anyone else? Would anyone else like to make comments during our public comment period? All right. If not, we will move on to the next item, which is the city manager's comments. The city manager is not able to be here this evening. She's attending a memorial event for the mother of a city employee, but Suzanne Ludlow is filling in.
Yes, our sympathies go to Deputy City Manager Wayne Hobbs and his family on the death of Wayne's mother. And we have a number of staff, I know, at the services this evening. Barb has given me several items to put on the record. The first is a report on the community center. On November 1st, a meeting was held to discuss certain outstanding issues related to the proposed PowerMax settlement agreement. PowerMax, the mechanical subcontractor for Phase 1 of the Community Center project, had filed a claim that was the subject of mediation in late May. Representatives of the city, Lawrence Abel and Associates, James F. Knott Construction, and PowerMax were in attendance. Following the above meeting, city representatives met with James F. Knott Construction to discuss the outstanding punch list work. A follow-up meeting will be held on November 13th. In preparation for that meeting, the city manager has requested that Lawrence Abel and Associates provide her with the estimated value of the punch list for Phase 1. The second item is that work on the elevator installation continues and that the installation will be complete by the end of the year. This is the elevator that would go in the front of the building, which will make it much easier to use the front of the building. On other matters, the Crossroads Development Commission met on October 31st. Gustavo Torres of Casa of Maryland reported on the status of the Prince George's County Workers Center for day laborers. Architectural work is underway. The best case scenario is that the Day Laborer Center would open in July of 2007. And we're pleased that they've received a number of grants and are working with the state and county agencies on that. On November 3rd, Sarah Daines, Alana Blanchard, and Barb Matthews met with David Edgerly, who's the Director of Economic Development for Montgomery County, and his staff to discuss the redevelopment of the New Hampshire Avenue corridor. And I will report that Barb and the other staff were very excited about the results of that meeting, that the discussion was very positive. There were some possible opportunities to work together identified, and I think that we'll be pleased to see the results. Staff will be scheduling a tour of the corridor from Mr. Edgerly's staff, as well as the planning and economic development staff from Prince George's County in the near future. And that's also related to the $38,000 from the state in terms of facade improvements along New Hampshire Avenue. On another matter, the closing date for the position of police chief, application for new police chief, was on November 3rd. The city manager will be reviewing the candidates with the Mercer Group later this week. Interviews are tentatively scheduled for the week of November 27th. And two other items, council members, please let Peggy Washington know if you're going to be going to the Tacoma-Langley CDA meeting on Thursday morning, and also the Montgomery County Chapter MML legislative dinner on November 30th. We need to make those arrangements. I also wanted to mention that I did follow up on the voting machines, and rec staff is going to try to do their best to close the wait room or otherwise secure the wait room until officials arrive.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Any questions? Okay. We will move on to the next item. We are beginning with a public hearing on the issue, on the proposed third speed hump for Willow Avenue. I think people are aware of what the situation is. Willow Avenue is being repaved, and there is some discussion as to the two speed humps that are already there, how they would be replaced. In addition, there's been a request for a third speed hump to be put on Willow Avenue to increase the protection against speeding vehicles. The public hearing is on the issue of the third speed hump, but since they are so closely linked, I would welcome comments on the Willow Avenue speed hump in general. Following the public hearing, the council will discuss in special session a proposal to authorize the third speed hump. So we are now opening the public hearing on the Willow Avenue speed humps. I would ask that when you come to the microphone, if you would identify yourself, and also if you would keep your comments to 3 minutes, and I will, as I was during public comment period, use the timer, and the timer will let you know when your 3 minutes are up. So is there anyone who would like to speak on this issue? Is there, I don't think there's a sign-up sheet. Oh, is there a sign-up sheet? Some of us can't see that far.
Okay. Some of us couldn't see the sign-up sheet
Okay.
anyway.
That, it turns out I wasn't the only one, so I think we'll just do this more informally, and if you would just, when you come up to the podium, identify yourself so we have a record for the public hearing. And I see Pat Lovelace is standing at the podium. Go ahead,
My
Pat.
name's Pat Lovelace, 7620 Maple Avenue here in Tacoma Park. And when you put the speed bumps in, again, I would like to reiterate and ask that try to make them more vertebrae friendly, so that when cars do go over those things, that they don't, that they don't end up half airborne and come down hard. Because as we know, there's a couple on Maple Avenue that are notoriously above the timber line almost. And they trip up a dinosaur, for God's sake. And I'd like to see, when we put in these speed bumps, we're a little more cautious and learn from our past mistakes, and we don't make the same mistake again. Because every time I go over those speed bumps, I feel it every single time. And sometimes, a friend of mine will be going to another meeting somewhere else, and we'll cut over Willow Avenue and cut down Tulip or whatever. And it'd be a nightmare to have to complain again, there's another speed bump, that's, dinosaur-sized when it probably doesn't need to be. And maybe the idea of a third speed bump, a lot more safer and a lot more, disability-friendly, might be a better idea than having two giant ones. It might be better to have three smaller ones, and I'm glad that that idea was proposed, because, sometimes more is better than less, if the less are going to be, mountains, and it'd be great if we could keep that into effect. Some of us have very, very fragile bones and other degenerative conditions that a large speed bump or one installed improperly could put us in a hospital and land us back in the operating room where I don't want to be. And I think there's a lot of other people who are elderly who have osteoporosis. And I don't know how many people like me have this bone-eating condition, but if there's one out there, they should also take it into consideration for them and any future people who have got problems when they do install these speed bumps. And I'm glad that they're proposing an extra one, which means we might not be able to have to build them so high. And also enforce the speeding laws. There are people who are going to speed over these speed bumps anyway. And if we can enforce the speeding laws and ticket them when we have to, maybe we'll get a lot more revenue for the city also. Thanks for letting me share.
Thank you.
Hi.
Yes.
I'm Margaret Atwell. Do you need my street address?
You're on Willow?
I'm on Willow
Okay.
Avenue. I'm at the the first speed bump at the top of the hill. And I will be the dissenting voice here, and I do not wish to have a third speed bump, nor do I wish to have them rebuilt as they are. I would like them to be smoother. I have a little car, it hangs up on them, and I find them very abrupt and bone-shattering. And I get to listen to all the people as they scrape and ram into them at my house and lose their parts of their cars in front of my house. So I vote no for them, please.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Mike Darian. stay in the same household as her. And the thing I want to speak of is a public safety issue. And while it may not be a very popular comment, there is a lot of speeding down our street. And anything that you can do to slow cars down would be greatly appreciated. I don't know if y'all have ever zipped up anybody in a bag who's been hit by a car, but I can tell you, it's not really a pleasant sight to go up and down a street and pick up folks' body parts. So just consider that in your deliberation. Thanks.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Denny May. I live at 7322 Willow. I've spoken to you before, and first of all, thank you very much for this extremely careful and fair attention that you've given to this subject. When I looked at this thing that you prepared for the discussion tonight, I was very impressed with how thorough and careful and fair that you've been with the whole discussion. I live at the bottom of the hill where the proposed third speed bump has been proposed, and I went out for my paper on Sunday morning early, and the first thing I saw as I walked out the door was somebody speeding up the hill, turning around from Valley View. My evidence is not technical, it's anecdotal. I think I'm probably the world's leading expert on traffic in that section of Willow Avenue. I've raised 2 kids there, and both are athletes. We've spent hundreds of hours on the street, carefully avoiding traffic, moving aside when traffic comes in, but I've been in a position to watch the traffic flow. A lot of people speed on the bottom of Willow Avenue. They get across those first 2 humps, they leave their mufflers up at Margaret's house, and then they just take off down the bottom. And I would really like to see another one there. I think it would add immeasurably to the safety and to the neighborhood quality of our street. We have cars parked along the side of the street there, and if somebody is speeding, there's no way that they can see somebody or some animal coming out from between those cars. So I would like to strongly request that you give careful consideration to the neighborhood request for an additional speed bump at the bottom. I also like the size of the current speed bumps that exist there. I think they're safe, and I think they do the job. I understand you have a lot of things to take into account with that. I know that there's a lot of variation from speed bump to speed bump. When I drive my old car, I have a new car and an old car. When I drive my old car down Valley View, I scrape every time I go down there. And what I have to do is slow to 0 and just crawl over that thing. It takes me about 6 or 7 seconds. And I don't mind doing that because I'm becoming, more acquainted with the trees and the traffic flow and all that stuff down on Valley View as I do that. It's not a great hindrance to me to slow down like that. So I understand you have to make a tough decision on the height of the speed bumps on Willow. I like the ones we have now. I'd like to see them replaced. They also have historical value. But I'm particularly interested in a new one at the bottom of the hill. And I also agree with my neighbor, Michael Darian's comment that there is speeding on Willow from Willow residents. There's an infamous, is that 3 minutes?
Yes.
Okay. We got one guy who comes around the corner and never pays attention. If there's a speed bump there, he would slow down, I think. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Bruce Kozarski, and I've lived at 7321 Willow across the street from Denny May for the past 10 years. During that time, as my children have grown from being toddlers to teenagers, I've seen many cars speed in front of our house. I don't have a radar gun, but it wouldn't surprise me if some of them were exceeding 40 miles an hour. So I strongly urge you to approve our proposal to place the third speed bump there. It's important in looking at this to remember that the 7200, 7300 block of Willow Avenue is probably the equivalent of 2 or 3 city blocks in other places. It's a very long block, and there's a pretty sizable gap between the previous location of the second speed bump and the intersection with Valley View. And there's plenty of time for people to speed up. And as Danny and others have testified, it does happen quite often. While my children are older now, there's a new batch of younger children on the block, and feel it's very important to have that third speed bump there. I also want to echo what Denny said about the new speed bumps matching the dimensions of the ones that we used to have. In my sense of them is that they were both higher than what seems to be the current standard, but just as important, were wider. So you kind of rolled over, and at 5 miles an hour, you went over smoothly. Faster, you didn't. Whereas, by contrast, other speed bumps, like the one on Valley View that Denny referenced, and one or two of the new ones on Maple, are high but thin, and you really have to come to a complete stop to avoid scraping the front of your car. On the flip side of that equation, the new speed bumps on Park Avenue are so low that you can go over them at 20, 25 miles an hour without any problem. So I would hope that you'd give consideration to a middle ground where you have a speed bump that's higher but also has a wider width and is gentler in going over, one that hopefully is designed to make it work at 5 miles an hour and not at a faster speed. Thank you very much for holding this hearing, and thanks for your consideration.
Thank you.
My name is Dave Goodis, 7328 Willow Avenue, and I really don't have a prepared or detailed statement. I have spoken with Denny, Steve, and Bruce on this, and I just wanted to register that I do agree with what they're saying. I've been in the neighborhood for 2 years, and the speed bumps that we had before they were taken out were the ones that I would choose, and I just wanted to register as my vote for what they are supporting the people that have already spoken tonight on that issue. Thank you.
Thank you.
Before I begin, just a question on point of order. Having appeared here twice before, is for the public hearing's sake, does one have to repeat everything from before or not? What is the protocol?
You're never required to repeat anything.
But it is essential to have things in the public hearing that is not said that's been said before, or is that sufficient?
No. If you would like it on the record in the public hearing, you can submit it to us. You can say it again. It's not necessary for you to say it again if you don't feel it's necessary.
I'll speak quickly and brief. Walking over here with my neighbor, Denny May, neighbor Steve Shapiro, by the way, 7324 Willow. We were about to cross Philadelphia, and Denny said, "What's that?" And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Look at those cars speeding up. What's the speed limit here?" It's 25 posted, and they're gunning up here on Philadelphia. I remember a few years ago, traffic was snarled. I had to go to the police station and say there's an accident right outside here. I think most folks in this city would love to see much more radar than we see. With respect to the Willow Avenue, what I've said before, our understanding is we're the first in the county. The first ones put in 82 were not sufficient. They were raised to the height that we had since 83 in order to sufficiently slow traffic down. We were told by neighbors that before the speed bumps, cars were being clocked by the police at 45 miles an hour. I speak in support of the third speed bump. A request from neighbors is that its placement be in such a way that it not create a drainage problem on the street, because it is, even though there are two slopes meeting at a drain, we would like to avoid major drainage problems. At the OTRA meeting a couple of weeks ago, neighbor Andy Kellerman, who is against all speed bumps, said that we have the option of getting radar guns and all to monitor speed, and that this is highly appealing. Whatever you put in or don't put in, I would love to see our block and other blocks get more involved with this. The city engineer's report, according to the document distributed, says that the current design, standard city design, is adequate. I did not hear very much convincing in terms of a solid evaluation how well these work and don't work. Some say depends on the car. We want to see a passive situation, whatever it takes to slow traffic down to an appropriate slow speed. With what my neighbor up the block, Margaret Atwell, says about auto parts, I have to wonder how fast these cars are going that they're losing parts, but I would be very tempted, if you do put in high enough bumps, to get a license to have a used auto parts business. I would welcome reaping the profit of these. That said, much obliged again to the city because whatever your ultimate decision, the process has been a great one, and our intention is to evaluate whatever is out there, and we, if necessary, we will be back and we'll organize plenty if whatever is put in is not adequate for this task. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who would like to speak?
My name is Andy Kellerman, and I'm the one who lives on Philadelphia Avenue, 18 Philadelphia. And my name was just invoked here. I am against speed bumps, and I am concerned, again, as I've mentioned on several occasions when speed bumps were in front of the council, that the discussion is about speed bumps. I mean, the last time I was here, the suggestion was made that the first step should be for an investigation of what is the appropriate traffic calming for that particular street, not jump immediately on the speed bumps. I think we're losing an opportunity. We now have a clean street. What should have happened was people should have looked at the alternatives for traffic calming, and there are a number of them. You all know them. One of the suggestions that Mr. Shapiro mentioned was, of course, actually checking the speeds, and not only that, but recording the license plate so that you have some sense of what is pass-through traffic and what is traffic generated from within the neighborhood. And if it's pass-through traffic, then one of the convenient ways of dealing with that is what's happening up in Rockville and many other areas, which is that the streets are signed so that rush hour they're closed from certain directions, so that you can't get into that street to make it a pass-through street. But you all know this. You all know, you've read the report. The reports have been presented to you. So, again, I think we've jumped. We're down a track here, and we've lost, or very close now, within minutes of losing an opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to speak at the public hearing? All right, hearing no one else, we will close the public hearing and move on to our special session discussion. I think Daryl is here, and the council has a number of pieces of information in front of it. Is there something you wanted to say, or are you just here for questions, Daryl?
Just here for questions, basically.
Okay.
There's nothing more that we intended to add. I think everything we have is in the packet.
Okay. Joy, is there something you wanted to say?
Yeah, a couple things. There were some things brought up during the hearing, and also some questions that I had from our previous discussions about this, and so I just want to follow up on those. One issue was that the old speed bumps on Willow were wider. Can you address that? I know you've told us they were 5 inches high and 6 inches high.
5 and 5.5. They were 12 feet wide. I think the difference is in the crown of the bump itself. The city standard speed bump, as you can see on your picture, and that's probably the best way to make sure we're all talking about the same thing. The city standard speed bump has the high section in a fairly narrow, what we call throat in the middle. It's 18 inches off the center. So your middle 36 inches of the 3 feet of the speed bump is where you have your highest dome. Whereas for speed bumps like Montgomery County, which I use that as an example because I think if you were to add 2 inches to the center of this and then just made the arc rise, that's more like what you had on Willow Avenue. A smooth, consistent rate up and a smooth, consistent rate down. It was fairly domed as opposed to ours that are kind of humped. In the middle, they don't have a narrow throat where the mound rises. So the type of speed bump you had on Willow was the 5 or 5.5 inch. It was 12 feet wide. It wasn't any wider than that. It's just a question of where the arc, how the arc was proportioned along that 12 feet.
And that Montgomery County standard is the one that is in the 7100 block of Maple. Is that right?
Yeah, there's one there. There's also the new ones we just put in on Woodland Avenue and Conway Avenue are similar to the Montgomery County standard.
And then the ones on Valley View, do you know which standard they comply with?
They're probably more reminiscent of the city standard. I do not know the height of those speed bumps. I haven't measured them, so I don't know how high
So they haven't been put in recently, I guess.
I don't know the date of when they were put in.
Must have been after the standard.
Yeah, I took a look at a record. We've actually had 26 speed bumps put in since the city standard. I don't know if anybody's interested in hearing what those streets are, but I have a list here if people would like me to read it off. Okay. There was a first one on Elm Avenue near where you live, Mayor, and I bring that up because that was actually just prior to the city standard. We made it at 4 inches and then had to shave it down to 3.5 because of complaints from the neighborhood that it was too high. That's on a fairly flat street. Again, when you have inclines and declines, it can affect people's experience of the speed bumps. But since that time, we've had 2 new ones put on in Hickory Avenue, 2 replacements on Park Avenue, 1 replacement on Allegheny, 2 new ones on Sligo Mill, 3 replacements on Spruce Avenue, 2 replacements on Baltimore, 1 on Glenside that's a replacement, 2 on Erskine replacement, 3 on Central replacement, 2 on Garland, 2 on Hopewell, and actually 4 on Larch. So a total of 26 replacements, or 26 speed bumps. Most of those were replacements. 4 of them were new installations.
Well, the challenge with this issue is in making sure that we don't build one too low. And I know that on Maple, we made the decision to err on the side of too high instead of too low because if shaving down does need to happen, it's very inexpensive. Whereas if they're not high enough, you have to tear it out, and it's thousands of dollars depending on the number of speed bumps you're putting in. Daryl, how well do you think our city standard is working? If we have 26 to show for it, have we collected any information about speeding on those streets or compliance with speed limit?
We don't have any hard factual data, where we've actually done traffic counts or radar gun analysis. Our determination to make that installation was based on the best available knowledge that was out there in the industry, in the traffic calming field, and we sort of made a selection that sort of blended the best of what we saw available and out there, and also kept in mind sort of the unique type of speed hump that seems to be more in favor by city residents, which is that kind of bump on a hump situation that we have. Our experience or our estimation is that the speed bumps are slowing traffic. A person's personal experience of that speed, when you're standing in one place or another and see a car coming at you at 20 miles an hour, that may look fast to you. It's within the speed limit, but that may be fast. Our speed bumps are marked for 5 miles an hour. Obviously, not every car needs to go 5 miles an hour to go over it, but that's what they're rated. The Montgomery County standard, which is smoother, is rated at 20 miles an hour. So that's just a standard safe speed limit that's put on those humps. So we significantly reduce the maximum speed that we think it's safe to travel our speed humps based on their profile. And that's all really I can say. I don't have a lot of awareness or knowledge of people complaining when speed humps are put in that they're not high enough or they're not significant enough. We have had the reverse happen where we've had to lower them, and we've heard about people complaining about Maple Avenue speed bumps and things like that. But again, it may just be symptomatic of what people complain about and what may motivate somebody to register that formally with the city. So we don't hear a lot of feedback. There have been occasions where people have raised an issue when we're replacing speed humps, and they're concerned about us putting in a lower speed hump. And once the installation's in, I think they experience the traffic and are resolved to deal with it, whether or not they feel like they can't fight City Hall and they're unhappy, or whether or not they feel like, oh, it's okay, it works. I can't distinguish between them. I just don't hear any feedback.
Just a couple more things. Some of the comments today have made me think that there's possibly support for us looking into speed camera enforcement on that street. It's certainly something that is available now to areas near schools. The issue of enforcement is an ongoing problem, and I know that the city manager is aware of the council's interest and priority for traffic enforcement. Just going back to the city standard, it seems to me that if it depends on the type of car, if it depends on the length of the street, the visibility that you have when you're driving on that street, to me those things don't add up to one-size-fitting-all. Can you say what your confidence in the city standard is based on? You said that there wasn't data to...
Well, this is a profile that the engineer developed based on looking at Institute for Traffic Calming and other organizations like that and what they have out there. Actually, most of what you see in the industry is much lower than what we have in the city. So actually what we created is something higher because we have a residential population that really likes high speed bumps. You won't find that kind of affection in Silver Spring for our type of speed bumps, but we tend to grow our own homegrown preference for them. So I think the city engineer's development of that standard took into account the industry standards, which by and large are 3-inch max everywhere you go because of ADA concerns, because of safety concerns, those kinds of things. And he's also was driven around the city enough to know that we had speed humps that were much higher than the 3-inch speed hump. So he created one that got a little closer to the standard that exists in the industry, and yet made a profile that required slowing down significantly in order to go over it. When you have those nice round crested speed humps, you can travel over them more quickly with less jolt than if you have the ones like ours are that have a sort of a convex dip before they go up and over the hump. So I think he tried to marry those two aspects of our speed humps together to give us what we could. We also have a city ordinance that requires speed humps to be in the 3 to 4 inch range. So he was trying to stay within that allowable range in the ordinance and provide the maximum bang for the buck, so to speak, for the speed hump.
Okay. And then the 4-inch speed bump, when using the city standard, and it rising to 4 inches, was the one on Elm that you said had to be shaved down?
That was the one experience that I'm aware of.
I think it was put in incorrectly. If I remember the statements at the time, there was some experience that it wasn't actually installed as it was supposed to be specified. I can tell you that most people on my street don't like it. So.
Yeah, we asked for 3.5 inch. The contractor
no,
ended
they
up
didn't like the
installing
first
a
one. They
4-inch
liked the
one.
second one a little better, but they still don't like it much.
Sorry, Darrell, what would you say?
I said we asked for 3.5. They installed 4. When we measured it, it was 4, so we had them shave off after complaints were received. Shave off a 1/2 inch.
But you feel that it is the city standard now?
Yeah, it's
it?
3.5 inch. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And it has the same throat depression and crown top.
I couldn't go over that in my motorcycle. I actually had to drive up onto the sidewalk to get
Yeah,
around it.
I think it's more abrupt than most of the city speed humps. And I think the complaints that have come from my street have not been that it doesn't slow people down sufficiently. The complaints have been in the other direction, that it's too abrupt and too jarring. And that and I think Darrell is correct, it's the old style, not the new style. And when the street is repaved, which I hope will be done if WSSE ever finishes the work they're doing, which probably won't be until the spring, it will be replaced with a standard city speed hump, yeah. And I just wanted to make a couple notes before we move forward with the discussion. I wanted to thank the Neighborhood Association for moving very quickly with the discussion of this. The council has tried to move this discussion forward as quickly as we could, since we are approaching the end of the time we'll be able to install anything that requires asphalt on a city street. Once it gets too cold, we can't do any asphalt installation. And so the only way to get any of the speed humps on before spring was to move this forward as quickly as we could. And so I want to appreciate everybody's patience and their willingness to consider this on a sort of expedited schedule. The other thing that I wanted to note was that we have a number of speed humps at various places in the city, and they're not all identical. One of the things that caused the council to be interested in putting in a city standard is that we had up until that point sort of an ad hoc process of installing speed humps, and there wasn't any discussion of effectiveness or what was an appropriate speed hump for an appropriate area. They just were sort of, I don't know, formed on the spot or whatever. I think the work that we've done and the experience that we've had with the new one shows that they have been effective. And I think that they probably are the best idea in terms of putting in speed humps. One of the things that we have been told is that speed humps that are too abrupt slow people down so much that they speed up after the speed hump, and as long as they're speeding up anyway, there's no reason for them to stop speeding up. Whereas if they can go over the speed hump at a consistent speed, they will remain at that speed. So there are some arguments for keeping a speed hump that is more realistic in terms of the speed of the traffic. The other thing that I wanted to note is I know the reason that we have speed humps is because they are a passive traffic control device. You don't have to have somebody standing there to enforce them. They enforce themselves. I know that in many streets, and I assume Willow is probably one of them, even though by law we can't reduce the speed limit to lower than 25 miles an hour, nonetheless, for many of these streets, 25 miles an hour really is too fast. On many of the older streets, they're narrow, they have parking on both sides, and a single traveling lane that includes two-way traffic, or as in my case in my part of the city, two-way traffic plus pedestrians, as we don't have sidewalks. 25 miles an hour is really too fast. And so we sometimes put in speed humps that control speed at lower than the posted speed limit, because the posted speed limit really is not reasonable for the street. So I think that this is one of those sort of difficult issues. There are people on the street who would like to have more severe speed bumps, people on the street who would not like to have speed bumps at all, or who would like to have less severe speed humps. And we also have a request for a third speed hump. I think it sounds to me as if a reasonable way to approach it would be to go with the city standard speed humps, which I do believe are effective and I do believe have been shown to be effective at the places that we've put them in, but put in 3, because I am concerned about the issue of the speeding at the bottom of the hill going either up or down. So that seems to me like a reasonable approach and something that I would support. And I think the next person I saw was Mark, and then I saw you, and then I saw Terry.
I have experience with both the speed bumps on your street and on Maple, and despite the fact that I've changed cars, my car bottomed out on the ones on Maple and bottomed out on the ones on Willow, even unless I came to a complete stop.
I know where your muffler is.
And I've learned, you know, if you look at the speed humps carefully in broad daylight, you can actually ascertain that they're not perfectly uniform across, and by approaching it at somewhat of the correct angle, I can avoid having to come to a total and complete stop before going over it. But short of that, I mean, it's really difficult to navigate, and to have to come to a complete stop and go over your rear wheel at the same time, that's amazingly annoying. And I know the ones that used to be on Willow, they never seemed to be 12 feet long. I mean, it seemed to me that hump was rather short, and you got hung up on the hump. It's one thing if your rear wheels are rising while your front wheels are going down over 12 feet. But it's a different thing when this thing is just like a bump you go over in the middle. It catches the bottom frame of your car, and I had that experience on both roads. But I was intrigued by something I saw in Annapolis, and I've seen it in a couple of other places, where they're now putting out prefabricated humps. They are absolutely jarring. They have all the charming effects of our hump on a bump or bump on a hump, and that if you hit it at any kind of speed at all, your car rattles, and it's incredibly unpleasant. But there's no risk of bottoming out, because I think the things are all of about that wide and about 3 inches high, and so you just come over to this thing and you just hit it, and if you're doing 20 miles an hour, you won't do it the second time at 20 miles an hour. It really forces you to slow down. But at the same time, it probably doesn't look like it's more than 3 inches high, so it's not, getting to anybody's undercarriage of the car. And I'm wondering whether, since these new speed humps seem to be being installed with greater frequency, have we looked at that?
Yeah, the engineer had just showed me some before. He was thinking in the means of situations like on Willow, where you've removed them, we're waiting, to put something in kind of in a temporary mode before you had a final solution. My understanding from what we've seen so far is they're really more for parking lots and other places. I haven't seen their application in streetscapes, so that's information that we'd need to gather. But most of the time you see those humps, they're meant for parking lots or, travel lane kind of things where you're in a sort of a contained area, not on a residential street.
I saw them on a regular street, but also in conjunction with narrowing, also done in a very inexpensive way. They were using artfully crafted old tires that looked like stanchions to create a kind of, what we call it, the Woonard that we produced over at whatever it was, Walnut. And they both had the hump there, but then they narrowed the road as you approached it, so that essentially your space you were going through wouldn't allow more than 2 cars if they passed each other, and it really visually made you want to slow down. Because you know what happens with the humps we have now. You put your right wheel as close to the curb if there's nobody parked there, and then you let your left wheel ride up, and that is one way of avoiding damage. But I think it might be worthwhile looking at some of these things.
Yeah, our other experience with them is that they're still pretty expensive. They have a limited life, but...
Just I have a couple comments, but just to kind of follow on Mark's comment about Annapolis, I don't remember who it was, but somebody was just recently telling me that in Montreal they have speed humps that are seasonal. They put them out for the warmer months and they take them up for winter. So those must be temporary as well. I'm certainly in favor of the third hump. I think that the humps are much more effective when there are more of them at lesser heights than the current installation on Willow. I think that tends to make people just kind of realize that you're not going to go through here too fast. I think when you have the high ones that you slow down for and then a long gap to the next one, you tend to speed up between them. I think the same thing happens when you have multiple stop signs. People, speed up between them, like on Aspen Street Northwest. You tend to want to get to the next one because you know you have to stop. So I think the third one certainly makes sense. I think the city standard makes sense. My recollection of the discussion on Maple Avenue is different from Joy's. I don't remember having a reason for the exception being that if it was too high, it was easier to shave it. It was the past history about why the humps went in and having to do with buses, ride-on buses on Maple Avenue. And I've always felt that that was one vote that I'd like to have back, that I'd like to not have put those taller ones in on Maple. I'm happy with the city standard, and any of the experience I've had with the 26 that have gone in since the city standard, the people I think have generally been happy, and I don't want to start making exceptions to the standard, because then I'd feel like we had to go back to anybody of the 26 who had them go in since and say, oh, never mind, it's inoperative, we're not doing the standard anymore. I don't want to keep revisiting it.
Terry?
Thank you, Mayor Porter. Heard people are happy with speed bumps, not happy with speed bumps. They think the cars are going too fast through the neighborhoods. Other than the anecdotal information, do we have any specific measurements? Have we done a radar analysis or LiDAR analysis of traffic on Willow Avenue?
No, we haven't done any radar.
Seems like that would be an important part of knowing what's going on, and maybe determine that the problem's worse than we're going to solve with a street design, that maybe we need some enforcement in that location occasionally. The other thing that strikes me is listening tonight to how much energy and time that staff and this council has put into speed bumps or humps or tables. I wonder what other, if we're still putting any energy in. I know that we've talked occasionally about other traffic calming devices, but not really to the extent that we have spent time on the speed bumps. I wondered if staff is still looking at other approaches and when we can see some fruit for those efforts.
Yeah, well, I think staff is certainly interested, both on planning staff and the Public Works city engineer, to use alternatives, and they promote them at every opportunity. It's hard to get a buy-in and a bite on a neighborhood street. The biggest and most significant detraction is usually parking issues. Any other alternative means that you're going to create on a street to slow traffic generally has to do with changing the curb line of the street, similar to what Mark was addressing in his Annapolis experience. I mean, that's what the direction of the field is. You need to have visual cues to people that tighten the lanes, that make you feel close, that make you have to slow down to navigate a narrower space. It's moving away from the large, wide suburban tracks and more into the smaller, narrow spaces. And, a lot of city streets have smaller, narrower spaces, so people generally
Sure, and a
tend
street,
to drive
like Willow, I don't think, we wouldn't be talking, we don't have a boulevard we have to worry about.
Yeah,
but
there you have the parking on one side, you have a lot of street parking, so there isn't really much option available for doing chicanes or bringing out a curb or doing throats, which are commonly other alternatives. There are places that we're planning to put some in. I think the one that's on the drawing board right now is Elm and Lincoln and Elm and Auburn. We did the traffic calming circles on Lockney Avenue. We've got a proposal that's still being discussed in the community in Doug's Ward on Glenside and Wildwood. So we are trying to raise those issues when we can, and in areas where it's clear that the expanse of asphalt is much larger than is needed, and
Sure.
we could bring it in.
But on a street like Willow, if the neighborhood was willing to give up a few parking spaces, would there be some other traffic calming devices that could be used?
Certainly, but I think it has pretty limited application on Willow Avenue. I mean, we could do some throats, we could do some, inter-block, mid-block constrictions where you bring the curb in, but I don't know that they would necessarily be more effective than a speed bump in that street, given that you have a lot of street parking.
To start with, yeah.
And then the other question I had in listening to Councilmember Elrich's discussion of the prefabricated speed bumps, I think we use those in our parking lot out back behind the building during the community center construction project.
They were actually made out of asphalt and not rubber, but they couldn't be reused. I think the ones that
Okay.
Mark has seen, you can install them and then take them up again and install them somewhere else. Those were, asphalt mounds that were then
Okay, but again,
removed
they're
when
very
they were broken.
narrow and not
They were
so
very
high.
narrow.
Not so high, but a significant bump. The other thing I noticed that was unique about those is they were put in an angle rather than perpendicular to the flow of traffic. And I noticed that really had an effect of slowing people down because it was, like you were stepping
Different
over it one
wheels.
wheel at a time. Has there been consideration of doing that on the streets?
Well, certainly it's an issue that's come up at the staff level when we look into the recommendations and what you find in the field on that. They're really not recommended because of the destabilizing effect it has on traffic. People can more likely lose control of their vehicles if they're approaching them at a fast speed and you've got that angle and your car is buffeted from one side to the next, so then you don't just have the up-down jolt, you also have the side-to-side jolt, and the risk associated with that kind of traffic slowing device is deemed just too great a risk.
Okay, thank you.
That's also really dangerous for motorcyclists and bicyclists, because the motorcyclists have to turn and hit it at a direct perpendicular angle, so you're making them make oddball maneuvers in the street into oncoming traffic.
I didn't need.
Motorized scooters have problems on them as
Yeah,
well.
any two-wheel vehicle is going to have a problem on that.
Okay, is that just something else?
The only other thing I would say is that because of the ADA issues, because of the ambulance access issues, I'm not a big fan of speed bumps to begin with. And I'm happy to support a third speed bump if the neighbors have filled out the paperwork, but I can't support speed bumps that cause physical damage and harm to people.
Doug?
I think the view as summarized by Bruce is the sensible one, and that is to support the third speed bump, but use the city standard and avoid the Mount Everest type bump, which we've seen on Maple Avenue and which is really over the top.
I'd like to,
No pun intended.
I'd like to go ahead and introduce this ordinance.
Okay, does somebody want to second it?
Second.
Okay. Is there any additional council comments?
I just have a couple of things that I think would serve us well in the future. We certainly should have specs for the Tacoma Avenue speed table, and I have yet to see that well-defined and also discussed in terms of where they should go and that kind of thing. I think for our city standard speed bump, if the engineer and our public works director are confident about it being an effective design, a good design, I certainly think that collecting evidence to support that view is a good idea. Since there are so many variables on our streets, how long the street is, how good the visibility is, different kinds of vehicles that go over these bumps. The speed limits are different. Actually, maybe the speed limits are always 25. That those kinds of considerations would be important as you are gathering evidence. And the issue Mark brings up is an interesting one, the temporary bumps being something to look at. My guess is the reason they don't put them in as permanent is because they wear down. Is that right?
Well, they have a limited life depending on the traffic.
Okay.
Yeah, they're not intended to be a permanent, in place permanently.
Does it simulate somewhat our city standard by being 3 inches, but ours has like the ramp on either side?
Yeah, probably close to that. I don't think that it's, our narrow spot in the hump is about 36 inches altogether, so I don't think they're as wide as that. Generally, they actually look smaller. They're usually about 2 feet, but they do have the optical appearance of being really narrow.
Mm-hmm. Probably because of how long cars are. It seems like it would be worthwhile for Public Works to look into the cost of those bumps, what their miles per hour are rated at, and how long they can last, and possibly use them on a temporary basis when we are repaving streets. But I do support the neighborhood's request for the third speed bump. It doesn't, however, appear that there's enough support for the modified speed bump style that's been discussed.
We did have, just to follow up, your Tacoma Avenue speed table. We do have the measurements of those, and I'll have the engineer send them to you. That research was done. We just didn't include it in the package here today.
Okay, well, since this is the first reading of this ordinance, if we could have it back before second reading, that would be helpful, because, you know, as soon as these issues pass, then they're shelved until the next time. So I'd appreciate being able to consider it as part of this.
Just a quick reminder to folks, there was a little discussion that I didn't quite catch the essence of right there, about 25 miles an hour. And just a reminder to residents on Willow that the state law is that it's 30 miles an hour unless posted differently. So unless you have speed limit signs on Willow Avenue saying speed limit 25 miles per hour, the speed limit on Willow is 30. And the city, we discussed a number of years ago whether there might be a reason for the city to basically stockpile a bunch of 20 or 25 mile an hour speed limit signs and post those as the neighbors request to drop the speeds on some of the residential streets.
Well, the issue between 20 and 25 is different. We can go ahead and post 25 at our decision. Going below 25 gets to be very complicated. It's theoretically possible to do, but it's not only our decision.
And I believe the city passed a speed limit, citywide speed limit of 25. So then we would be, do you remember that?
I don't remember, but I remember we've done a number of things to try and reduce speeds.
Right. It was before my time, but when I was new on the council, I did ask for that to be reviewed, and the city manager and police chief showed me exactly where and when it had been passed as a citywide speed limit of 25 unless otherwise posted.
Okay.
Yeah, one of the challenges there, just not to get too deeply in this topic, but oftentimes residents don't want the 25 mile an hour speed limit posted on their street because it actually encourages people to drive faster than what is a safe speed on the street. So we're in a catch-22 where if you post it, then people are going to speed up to go 25, and really it's a street that you should be driving 15 miles an hour on.
Okay. All right. Are there any additional council comments? Are there any public comments on the ordinance? You don't need to repeat anything that you said in the public hearing, but you're welcome to make public comments on the ordinance in front of the council.
Andy Kellerman, 18 Philadelphia Avenue. Just to comment on some of the comments that were being made, and I believe what needs to happen is that there's some steps should be added to the process of achieving traffic calming. And one should be that when a neighborhood gets to the point where they want something like that to happen, then somebody should come around and give them or provide them with the options. I think what's happening, and I certainly know that it happened with Ultra, is that people are not aware of the options for traffic calming that are there. So everybody knows speed humps. Everybody knows speed bumps. So that's where everybody goes. So that's the first thing that's picked out of the drawer to be used, the first tool. It may or may not be the right one. And that is the traffic calming issue. And the other issue, which I've mentioned before but was not commented on, but I'd like to bring it back up again, is that that whole area, which is subject to pass-through traffic, signage, closing streets during rush hours, you know, can't make a left turn here or can't make a left turn there during 7 to 9 a.m. or something like that. I understand the issue of passive, the passive enforcement, but now that we might be able to get, you know, speed cameras and whatnot, and you know, it would be an interesting test to use one of the cameras to enforce some of these, you know, you can't make a left turn here kind of thing. And that would be another one of those 24/7 type of enforcement thing. So again, all I'm trying to do is open, you know, open a number of doors here instead of just continuously adding bump after bump after bump. Thank you.
Thank you.
Steve Shapiro, three things. I think that some of Andy's suggestions and ideas, which we've seen in other parts of our county and area, are excellent, and for the mid and long range, the city should be encouraged to explore such things. It's not clear to me from the exchange between Joy and Darrell whether for the second reading next week there will be data where the city has radar data on the standard speed bumps on what people are going over, but it seems to me that having such data would enlighten your discussion and your decision. With respect to possibly instituting a 25-mile-an-hour speed limit on Willow Avenue, the 7300 block already has signs, although the one in front of my house is bent over and somewhat obscured, but it's already posted 25 miles an hour, so there's no need to reduce it. It's only a matter of getting it complied with. And thanks again.
Thank you. I wanted to add, just in response to some of the comments, that the city has had in place and has done for a number of neighborhoods, neighborhood-wide traffic studies that resulted in recommendations. I know there was one done in my neighborhood, recommendations for various ways of traffic calming. And my recollection is that most of them ended up the way my neighborhood did, which is the only recommendations that actually the neighborhood agreed with and that were acted on were the speed humps. So we did go through the process and consider a number of things, and what we ended up with were speed humps. So most of the others, as Darrell pointed out, do have major impacts on people who live on the street. Narrowing the street eliminates parking spaces, making the streets one-way, inconveniences residents. So it may be that speed humps, because of their simplicity and self-enforcing nature, have some advantages that means that they end up sort of at the top of the list. But it isn't that we don't consider other things, it's because this is what we end up with. But I agree with you, we need to continue to look more widely at a number of things. So I appreciate that. Bruce.
I've got one suggestion on this. Mr. Loveless, 7620
Yep.
Maple Ave. I was wondering if they could encourage the neighbors to use video cameras, since everybody seems to have one nowadays, and they catch these speeders going down their road, taking their license plates down. If there's a way that we can publicly display the names and license plates of these people who are doing it, and maybe embarrass them into a compliance. Maybe we wouldn't have to need such high speed bumps and risking injury to people like me and others. If we could get the neighbors and stuff, like to form a club that will take photographs of these idiots out there and then, embarrass them, give them a really good embarrassment, put their license plate and their name and photograph right there in the newspaper, right there out on cable news, and let everybody see who they really are.
Now, that's certainly a creative idea, but
then they can't say, I didn't do it. Then the proof is right there. And then,
Okay.
as a result of that, we can fine them afterwards.
Okay.
Well, and actually,
thanks,
the
Pat.
police already give tickets. Isn't that
Yes.
public record?
Yes, the police do give tickets, but the police have to have proof of speed, which I think is the piece that's missing there.
What I'm saying is it public record who has gotten a ticket?
I think so.
Might be interesting for...
The city attorney is nodding yes.
It's public record, but probably not published record.
She said it is public record who's gotten speeding tickets but not published record.
It
Bruce.
might be interesting just to... I'm sorry.
Just a quick request that we can have some information back for second reading next week that the chief or anybody else could provide about the status of a citywide speed limit being 25 rather than 30. That would be helpful.
Okay. All right.
And as additional information, it might be interesting to know how many speeding tickets were issued on Willow Avenue in the last year.
All right. Is that finished? Okay. Is council ready to vote? All right. This is the first reading on this issue. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? The ayes have it, and the ordinance passes. We will have second reading of the ordinance next week. As I said, we are trying to move this forward quickly so that we can actually implement it before it gets too cold to do additional asphalt work.
And
Thank
just
you
a last
all.
note, I know one of the comments was to provide radar information. That was not what I understood I was going to be doing between now and second reading. I was going to be providing Joy with the Tacoma Avenue speed table dimensions.
He was asking for clarification on when I encouraged you to gather evidence to support the city standard, whether that would be available next week. I wouldn't expect it to be. That's actually a longer-term project, in my view.
I'll relay the request to Barb. Let you know.
Thank you.
Okay, let's move on to the next item, which is a discussion of the city committees. We have in front of us some information that has been pulled together by the city clerk. The city clerk has actually done a fair amount of work on this, pulling together council member recommendations from a number of committee participants and officers of city committees. And I asked her to sort of suggest for us some sort of bite-sized chunks that we could look at it. If we
Glad you
wanted,
mentioned that. Yeah, thanks.
there's a bite-sized chunk, there you go. So that we wouldn't, it could easily take us hours to go through everything that's been suggested to us. So what we have in front of us this evening is the issue of people applying for committees and the issue of what kinds of reporting requirements there are. If there are also additional issues that the council would like to suggest that aren't on the list, that we haven't put on the list so far, we could do that also, but I don't want to go too far afield this evening. Is there anything you wanted to say?
Well, I just wanted to point out that the city clerk did pull together a very helpful chart of the
Yes.
different committees that identify the varying requirements of the different committees as to whether they report back to you or not, whether they have term limits, if there's quorums, a variety of aspects. And as you mentioned, in terms of the bite-sized chunks, the two items that were discussed that may be useful to address this evening do have to do with, do you do interviews, especially in reappointing people to committees? And the second is, do you wish to have a consistent requirement of the committees or a couple consistent requirements about whether the committees report back to you on a semi-annual basis or that kind of thing?
And let me just elaborate on that a bit. It's been commented on that we don't have the same reporting requirements for all committees. And in fact, the council in effect uses the interviews for reappointment as a way of finding out what's been going on for committees. One thing that we could do as an alternative would be to require periodic reports from all committees and not interview people who are up for reappointment. We would have to act on the reappointments, but we wouldn't necessarily have to do an interview for reappointment. And we could simply ask the committees for a written or verbal report on a periodic, say, annual basis. And that might be a way of expediting things for both the council and the committee members without our losing information. So that's something that I throw out there for council's consideration. I think I saw Mark's first and then Terry's. I'm sorry, and then Bruce's.
Just to clear up for me, am I understanding this that some other comments have been made, that all committees are supposed to keep minutes, but the reality is that all committees do not keep minutes?
That's right. There's an open meetings requirement.
Well,
Or there's a city administration.
Is there automatically an open meetings requirement if it's a committee?
If it's a council-appointed committee,
So then it's not if there's an open meetings requirement, there is an open meetings
That's
requirement.
correct.
For all the council committees.
Yes.
And they're not keeping minutes right now.
Some are not.
Some are, some aren't.
Right.
did you?
I don't think it's necessary.
Go ahead.
I don't think it's necessarily the case that they're not keeping minutes. I think the breakdown comes in sometimes with the staffed committees and the unstaffed committees and having the minutes submitted to the city.
The minutes need to be available for the public to review and that kind of thing.
Right, and they may be keeping notes on their meetings, but those meetings aren't being made available for public review.
Some of the
I see.
committees are more independent than others and function a little bit
Okay.
My recollection is, and just following up on Councilmember Elrich's question, is that when we have talked about the Open Meetings Act in the past and some of the struggles that we have faced in making sure that we're in compliance with these council meetings, that we've just specifically asked staff to make sure that all committees are keeping minutes and announcing their meetings, as both of which are required by the Open Meetings Act. So it's disappointing to hear now that maybe that's not being complied with. And I don't think that, and we'll get into this at another time maybe when we're talking about, staff's role in committees, I don't think that staff has to be, first of all, I don't think staff should be a member of a council advisory committee. And I certainly don't expect staff to be providing resources such as a minute taker or a secretarial service for council-appointed committees. I think it's quite adequate for committee members, and it's historically, I think, the way committees have worked, that committee members do record their minutes and publish them in a fashion that's available to the rest of the community. There are some services that staff could provide, but I don't think we need to have full staff support for all committees. Going back, you mentioned, Mayor Porter, that there's a list of things, and we're only going to consider a couple of those tonight.
Yeah.
And I didn't see in this write-up, did I miss it, that there's where that list is of all the things that we...
I think that one of the ideas is that we would also get some of that information from you this evening, so we can make sure that we have a complete list.
When we first dealt with this some months ago, there was a list that was published, and it wasn't included with this information. But Jesse, I think, still has that list that we originally put together, along with the additions that have been made to it by members of the committees and members of the council. Would you like a copy of that list
Yes, I
again?
appreciate that. That would be very helpful if we
Will you
could
send
get
that out
a
to the
copy
council?
again.
Sure.
Thank you very much. So which are the things that we're going to talk about tonight, then?
We're talking about the issues of interviewing committee members and the issue of, what was the second thing that I said?
Reporting
Oh,
back
the
to
reporting
council.
requirement, the connection between interviewing people and the reporting requirements for committees.
Okay, and I support the suggestions that you made, and as I recall, as far as interviewing committee members, that the interviews should, number one, be interviews and not be a time to understand what the committees are doing. It shouldn't be a reporting out of the committee, since the person being interviewed isn't necessarily the official voice of the committee for their status and what they're working on, what their plans are for the future. Number two, I agree with you that I don't see a need to re-interview individuals who are basically just re-upping for the committee. I think that we certainly need to do the reappointment, but I think at that point we know who the individuals are, and if there are issues to be dealt with, then the committee itself as a body could bring those issues to our attention. And I think that would save a significant amount of time. As far as reporting requirements for the committees, I agree with you that we should have periodic reporting of the status of the committee and on the goals that they've been working towards, and also I think at the same time, and I originally was thinking of like quarterly meetings, but I guess that different committees might have different frequency that you would want to receive the reporting, but that a major part of that would be what are the goals and kind of concurrence of this council with the plans for the committee and what their goals are, and how we're going to know if they attain those goals during the next reporting cycle. So that's a long-winded way of saying I agree with what you're saying, and I've tried to fill in some of the detail of what I'd expect those reporting sessions to be.
Okay. Bruce?
Yeah, I also tend to agree. I think I started out even this evening, thinking that that we definitely need a tighter report back process. I was tempted to say we could still, the interviews still had some merit, even for the people seeking reappointment, but I can see where if we do it right, that the report back from the committee structured maybe differently for different committees with some options on reporting back to us in the meeting or something in writing, that there can be a proper mix of that. I can see where that would maybe take care of the need for some of the re-up interviews. I think following up on where Terry was going there a minute ago, I think one possibility for a kind of a default report back mechanism might be the appointments for the committees are basically broken up into 4 quarterly, like September 30th, June 30th, and they're divided up to kind of break up that. And I think maybe approaching that deadline, kind of with that, let's say, for instance, if it's the Committee on the Environment is June 30th, then maybe by June 30th there ought to be some kind of report back, so that as they get ready for maybe some reappointments or whatever it might be, that's a good time to tie it in. I think it would be very valuable to have a little flexibility on how that might happen. I think it would be very helpful for the council to have essentially the committee come up with a kind of a official feedback report, so that might help them focus as well on some of the things that they want to either continue or change. One thing I wanted to go back to for a minute on where Mark was going on the minutes. I was noticing that in terms of the chart that the clerk did, that the quorum sometimes is specified a little oddly, and I know that the quorum is what determines whether it's an official meeting and therefore whether minutes are required. I see where on the facade advisory board that the quorum is 3 voting members according to the code, but 4 voting members according to the bylaws.
Actually, quorums, I think, is one of the issues we're going to get to, because it's a whole issue in and of itself.
Okay, but I just wanted to point out that that's what triggers the membership requirements, and to point out for when we do have the discussion that on the noise control board, it's defined as a majority of active members. There are 7 members, potentially 7 members on that board. A majority of active members could be 1.
Well, I mean, there's a number of issues about quorums and what constitutes a meeting and when they can make decisions and those kinds of things.
I think
and that's probably more than we can get into this evening. So
why don't you? I'm just pointing out that there are a number of
hold that thought.
There are a number of oddities in that column.
Hold that thought.
That require discussion, and I think my overall reaction for the topics that we're supposed to be covering this evening are that we need a better reporting requirement for things like the tree commission, where there is none, the ethics commission, where it just says meet quarterly. There should be something back on that. There should be something back on the emergency preparedness committee, and the board of elections, even though we're just kind of getting into that one right now, that there is no reporting requirement. I think those are all committees that would greatly benefit from reporting.
Mark.
I support the idea of having the reporting requirements. I think of all the time I've been on the council, I never felt that the interviews we did for people, whether initial interviews or follow-up reappointment interviews, really ate into hours and hours of meeting time. So I don't know that it's not worthwhile to re-interview. I agree with Terry that the re-interview shouldn't necessarily be a report on the committee. If we want to report on the committee, we should ask the committee for a report. But I don't know whether it's sufficient to put the burden of bringing a quote-unquote problem to the council, or having the committee bring a problem to the council rather than the council just flat out committing itself to interviewing everybody just above board. I mean, how would we do it if who would we select to re-interview? somebody that the majority of the committee objected to, somebody that one person on the committee objected to, somebody that a citizen of the community objected to. I mean, it seems to me that it opens the door to the things we may not want to get into, and I don't know that the interview process has been burdensome for us.
But how would you raise that in an interview? Are you going to ask people who are up for reappointment, well, have you caused any problems on the committee this year?
Well, I think if we're not going to do it, then it's almost like why even bother to pretend you're having an interview process? Somebody's got to ask that question.
Well,
I think that was my point, is we don't ask that question, and
yeah, I mean,
so
you're
why
free
have
to-
them come in for a re-interview?
Yeah.
We're going to reappoint them anyways.
I've been to at least one interview through one of you that got testy and somewhat contentious when an issue was raised. I don't know that it's happened as many times.
I remember a couple of cases since I've been on the council where somebody applied for appointment, initial appointment. In one case, this was many years ago, and I don't think most people here were on the council, where somebody stated in their initial application interview that they wanted to be appointed in order to terminate the committee, and they didn't get appointed. But generally, you know, the purpose of the initial appointment interview is for the council to assess the person's background, you know, the kinds of things they're interested in, what they want to do. I don't think those things change when a person comes up for reappointment. And, you know, I don't object to doing reappointments. It's an issue for the council in terms of time. It's an issue in terms of the applicant in terms of time and scheduling. And this issue for the city clerk, who spends a fair amount of time tracking people down and calling them back and trying to schedule mutually convenient times for them to come in for interviews. And I'm not sure that we get out of the reapplication interviews something that's commensurate with the amount of time that we put into it. And also, I'm not sure that's where an issue of someone who is causing a problem, where that kind of thing comes up. I mean, the council is always free not to appoint someone, but I don't see us in an interview sort of saying, well, you know, have you been going to all the meetings? We don't ask that question. We could. Have you been going to all the meetings? What's the reason you weren't to this meeting? What's the reason you weren't to that meeting? I mean, we could do that, but we don't tend to do that.
Well, let me ask the question a little bit differently. I mean, one of the implications of that is that when when a person's term expired, normally we would say, you know, anybody could apply for that position. If we were to go this way, there'd be no point in asking anybody to apply, since essentially we're treating it as you continue to serve as long as you want to continue to serve.
Well, it wouldn't.
So we wouldn't ask anybody. If I knew that you were automatically, no matter what, going to reappoint somebody, why advertise it in the paper that there's, you know, potential vacancy coming up, please apply for it?
My understanding.
Well, I was just going to say, the council could do it either way. We could choose to advertise vacancies when they came up, even if it was someone who was up for reappointment. The other thing, and this may be what, I won't guess what Terry was going to say.
No, go ahead.
I don't recall a time when there's been someone who wanted to be reappointed to a committee where we haven't reappointed them. I mean, there have been a number of...
I think...
One? Okay. I don't remember, but generally when people apply for reappointment, they are reappointed unless there's some issue. Actually, I know which one you're talking about, too. And that was one where it wasn't raised in the interview. It was raised by other committee members. I'm sorry, Terry.
That's okay. Now, what I was going to say is that what I understood that I was agreeing to in the beginning of this discussion was that people coming up for reappointment, committee members coming up for reappointment would not be re-interviewed, but the council would revisit their appointment. In other words, we would have to take a affirmative action to reappoint the member. So there would be the opportunity for us to appoint someone different if someone's a stronger candidate came along that the council wanted to put on, you know, to fill the vacancy with.
And I think that the council might have an opportunity to get information back from the committee if that report back from the committee was tied to the time when their appointments expire. We would know before we were trying to do reappointments.
Okay. That's a good point, too. I also had another couple of things that I thought about. I think that we should require reports of all committees. I think they should be at least annual. Now, some of the committees have more frequent reports, and I would be fine leaving the more frequent reports for the committees that have them now, but I would put at least an annual report for all committees. It could be in writing, well, it should be in writing, and we wouldn't have to actually sit and speak to them unless we both wanted to do that, or unless the council, I guess, put it this way, wanted to do that. But that there ought to be at least a written annual report, and that it ought to include the names of the current members, which I think we've got, and the number of meetings they've had, and the things that they've done, particularly things that they've decided. And I think they would probably have to keep minutes in order to give us that last thing. And in terms of the goals, I think that's something that we should probably spend a little bit more time on and not decide tonight. But most of the committees have charges in the legislation that establishes the committee. Their goals essentially have been set out for them by the council. And we could certainly look at accomplishments in relation to the charge to the committee, which I think would be a very good thing to do.
Yes, I agree. I think what I was thinking about is certainly looking at, what are the objectives of the committee and that have been, in the legislation that establishes the committee. But I was thinking about kind of looking at how they're going. What are the various steps that they see in attaining those goals, and how are they doing in relation to that? And does this council agree with those steps, or do we think they're stepping in the wrong direction? Was kind of the thought that I had as far as the reporting requirements. And yeah, I think having it as a written report in addition to the presentation here at the council is helpful, because it certainly documents what's going on, but it also provides the ability to give a lot more detail than what council members might be able to do in a meeting in the limited amount of time they have here. The other thing I wanted to comment, going back to the questions about the Open Meetings Act that we touched on briefly in the beginning, I would just like to make sure that this council, before tonight's over, does direct the city manager to make sure that all council-appointed committees understand that they are to be producing minutes of their meetings, and that those minutes should be provided to the city clerk on a I'm not going to define the limits, but within the time period that the Open Meetings Act specifies, which is, I think, a reasonable time is what it says. And that I would also like to say that that it is not city staff who should be taking the minutes for committee members. And thirdly, that I think the city staff should be posting the notices of meetings, again, within accordance with the Open Meetings Act, so that the public does know when meetings will be taking place and where they'll be taking place, and that they are, in fact, open meetings whenever a majority of the committee is present.
I agree with where you're going, Terry, and I think that the council, the staff and the city manager have made that notification to committees. I think the difficulty is in the unstaffed committees that the staff may simply not get the information. One of the things, and this is going a bit beyond our issue this evening, I think it would be helpful perhaps to do more to educate members of the committees about the requirements of the Open Meetings Act, because I think it's a question of not understanding it, or not understanding the seriousness, or not understanding that they're covered. I mean, they're being told they're covered, but they think, not really. And so perhaps doing something more assertive to or proactive to let them know what the requirements are. I was thinking maybe even of doing a training such as Jack Schwartz does at MML, for asking him to come, or someone like him to come and do a training for our committee members. I think might be really helpful. I think he's very good and is able to sort of talk about the details of the requirements in very clear and detailed terms.
I agree with you that training would be helpful, but I think that a short one-page memo could easily describe the fact that you need to have minutes for your meetings, and those minutes have to cover all actions and votes that have taken place, and that, number two, you have to let city staff know at least 2 weeks in advance of your meetings of when and where they're going to take place.
And my suggestion was going to be that it might be a good idea if some of us on the council who have been through many of those trainings wanted to offer our services, and I will do that, to go to any of the committees who feel that it would be helpful to have a discussion of that. We could, do it all in 15 or 20 minutes at one of their committee meetings and have that to make that information available to them.
Yeah, we could do that, and I also think, but I still think it would be helpful because there are issues for committees that may be slightly different from, the whole issue of the quorum and what constitutes a quorum and what you can do without a quorum is legally tricky. So that might be something that he could cover maybe, because quorums are not an issue for us. We know we can't operate without one. But whether the committee could or not and what it could do in the absence of a quorum, it might be a little trickier. Colleen?
I think it's a good idea to have a minimum reporting requirement, and that 1 year would be the absolute minimum reporting requirement that I think we should support. And regarding the interviews, I find the interviews of new people useful for meeting the people. I don't find them that useful for getting information about how they might interact with the committee, especially if they haven't been to any of the committee meetings yet. So I think that sort of related to some of his suggestions about having people go to the committee meetings first, that would be good, because then they would have something to reflect back and would have a better sense of them. But at this point, I'm finding them useful mostly for recognizing their face so that I know them later. And regarding the people who have already been on the committee, I think that we get a lot of reporting back information from them, but I'm always frustrated because I feel like that's not the appropriate venue for getting information back at the point when 1 of 10 or 12 people on a committee might happen to be up for reappointment. I do find it useful for thanking the people for their time on the committee, though. So I'm not really finding the interviews useful for the purpose that they're supposed to be for. And just in general, I'd like to say that I do appreciate the very thoughtful comments that we got from Andy Kellerman and Catherine Tunis, and I pretty much agree with all of the things that they say. And as another sort of general broad comment without getting into any specifics, I would really like to see a more uniform approach to the committees, not that every committee has to interact in the same way, but maybe that there's a set of a bare bones structural requirements for all of the committees that every committee has to meet.
Okay, so let me summarize what I think I heard in terms of where we are right now. I'm hearing a majority of the council not in favor of interviewing people for reapplication. The understanding would be that the council does need, and this is the current law, does need to act on the reappointments, but that we wouldn't necessarily need to interview them. But that we receive periodic reports at least annually. The minimum would be annually. In some cases, the committees have to make more frequent reports. They would be in writing. They could also be verbally, but they would be at least in writing. That the reports would include the committee's accomplishments or the steps in relation to the committee's charge as the council has laid it out, and that the reports would be provided to the council, and we would have to discuss this more when we got to the issue of the committee terms. They would be provided to the council prior to the interviews prior to the end of the committee term, not the interviews, prior to the end of the committee term, so that the council could take that into account in looking at possible, reappointments of people. And also that the city manager or some appropriate person who she designates is going to send a notification to all the committees that they are under the open meetings law and generally what that means. And the council is going to specify in future discussions more about how we would make that information available to committees. And we've had a number of suggestions on the table in addition to that. Did I cover everything, and is everyone in agreement with where we are? Okay. All right. We will take a short break and come back for the other 2 items on our work session agenda. the code section on peddlers and transient merchants. Erwin Mack had alluded to this in his comments at public comment period. I don't believe he's still here. Now, we have a memo from you talking about how complicated and difficult this issue is. You want to, is there anything you want to make a presentation on?
Well, the purpose wasn't to say it was complicated, it was more to say that it is important that the regulation be pursuant to police powers that you have rather than other more, difficult to kind of describe things such as aesthetics.
Well, I was being facetious, I hope you know.
But what we really think would be helpful is to get more of a sense of what the council's concerns are so that we can see what kind of drafting can address those concerns. We also think that we're not clear, and we want to know what you think, as to whether the law is fine that's in place, which is both city licensing and the county law, or whether it's an issue of enforcement, and whether there needs to be more attention to the enforcement details. There's only a few transient merchants that so far have licenses in the city, and those are specified in the materials for tonight.
Did you have anything you wanted to bring to our attention, Doug?
Well, I think that the memo is really very good and helpful, although it may be not as encouraging as I hoped that the law would be on the matter. I do, though, take some heart in the discussion about the aesthetic considerations, in particular the gateway area, which, as we know, is one of the areas where perhaps most of the transient merchants are congregated. And we also have the other stretch, of course, along New Hampshire Avenue, which, arguably also is an aesthetic area in that it's near the creek and wooded areas, but it's also the scene of some unsightly business activity in the form of more than one business congregated at the same place with outrageous signage. The signage, of course, may be governable by other county statutes that we can look into. But I do think that the proposal here to work with the county to try to approach this as an aesthetic and gateway issue seems to be the one with the most merit, and I would certainly encourage us to use all of the resources that we have to try and follow that approach.
One thing I know that Prince George's County has done is to try and move vendors into specific areas. And I noticed that is one of the things that you mentioned as being a possibility. You can't tell them they can't offer their services, but you can put them in specific areas, which is, I think, what Prince George's is doing, if I remember correctly.
I have a copy of the Prince George's legislation, and the difference is that they're talking about vendors, transient merchants on the public right-of-way. So it's much more possible to regulate that they must be in certain specific parts of the public right-of-way. What our ordinance deals with, and what our current situation is transient merchants on private property. They're either on the shopping centers, or in the case of the 7-Eleven, they're on a private lot. We have not had the issue of, and Montgomery County doesn't permit the issue of vendors on the public right-of-way.
Okay. Yes.
How many licenses did you say we have now?
5.
5? Okay. All right. So we have a police power to address blight issues, though, right? That's part of a police power, right?
Yeah, I actually was going to go back to Councilmember Barry's point a little bit on that. When you said the aesthetics of the Gateway, the one that I thought was the most helpful for the Gateway might be one around revitalization, commercial revitalization, where we have a long legislative track record of saying that is our public concern there. And given we have that clear public concern, you can rest these kinds of additional concerns on that bedrock.
The taco truck at Eastern, at 410 in New Hampshire, is on that site, and that site has a really difficult time maintaining some level of cleanliness, and just the amount of trash that's on it is intense. And part of it's generated, I know, by the fact that it's at the intersection, but I think that adding additional businesses to the site that are sort of ad hoc businesses doesn't help the trash issue. And also, in the case of this one, it caused them to move their trash cans right up next to the townhouses. And I've been kind of collecting information about how a lot of this previously had transpired, but the granting of this license basically ended up in the moving of this trash can, which smells really bad. And apparently in the initial agreements when they were developing the site, there was something in it about how that particular trash can would be sited, and it was not right next to the townhouses. And so I think that's an issue of the kind of the trash that's generated around these businesses. Another one is, just finding a way to cope with the commercial competition issues, because we require standard businesses to comply with all kinds of regulations that I think in giving these transient business applications, they don't have to. And one example would be parking. The number of parking sites that you have to have for a particular commercial application, and how does that come into play when we have private business owners who are allowed to invite these transient businesses onto their sites, and they don't have to go through cope with any of those kinds of issues, like how many parking spaces that they have. And the other thing I wanted to ask is, could we, around the aesthetics issues, could we have gateway designations? And along with those designations, part of that would be, if it's a gateway designated area, that we don't allow these businesses in that area, in part for the aesthetic issues, but in part for the issue about some of them are also revitalization areas. So could we have these kind of overlays of a gateway designation, which is an aesthetics issue, or the revitalization issues, which is the blight issue, and back to the police power?
Yeah, I've got a couple comments. One of the first things is that in order to locate on somebody's property, the various transient merchants are supposed to comply with the underlying zoning. So they are supposed to have enough parking for them, as well as not take away required parking for the underlying use on the property. And that's supposed to be something that they are complying with. If they are not, then that's something that we can and have cited them on as a reason not to allow them at a particular location. Another thing is that, we have to use a lot of personal persuasion sometimes with the underlying property owner to say, gee, this isn't the right place, or there should be a certain kind of arrangement to help improve the area. And, I think we try to do that. I know that individuals within a business association try to do that, but we may not have done it in as targeted and effective way as we can. And I think that that's something that doesn't take any kind of change of law for us to do that, but it's basically an initiative that we then push to say we really care about the appearance of this corridor, and we want to see this kind of thing improved. The item that you mentioned about the moving the trash cans closer to the townhouses, again, they are required to comply with whatever site plan was put in as an approval of their location. So it may be something that we can address to say that you cannot allow a stand to change the requirements of the site plan. And so I hadn't heard that. That'll be interesting for us to look into.
You know, I think one of the dilemmas is that it seems like what we're saying is that there may be some areas of the city where a pupusa wagon is not appropriate. I, for example, like pupusa wagons. I've visited the one on Eastern Avenue and have spent time there sitting on the green plastic chairs, admiring the scenery, and especially the food that they serve there. But I don't think it would be appropriate to have it at the gateway at the crossroads, nor does it seem appropriate to have a flea market as the first thing you see when you come down New Hampshire Avenue, and that's the gateway to the city. So I think it is important for us, if we can, to be able to specify what kinds of businesses should be in what sorts of areas within the city, if we can do that. And you know, the other point is that you know, part of what's special about that part of town is that it does have this wonderful mix of ethnic groups and the kinds of businesses that they operate there. And I certainly would not want to use the law to prohibit them from plying their trade, which adds to the cultural richness of the area. But at the same time, it seems to be not serve the public good to have certain kinds of businesses in these very critical areas of the city, like the Gateway, or areas that we're attempting to revitalize. But I agree with you that we have existing codes on the books that can be enforced to take care of garbage issues or the appearance of these places, and that might be sufficient.
I, certainly support most of what Councilmember Berry has said and what my colleagues have said tonight, that, I think blight or just, trashy areas, we need to enforce, proper maintenance of the properties and make sure that our city does look neat and clean, especially in our commercial areas. Residents tend to take care of the residential areas, but within the commercial areas sometimes the property owners don't pay as close attention to the cleanliness. Some of them don't. And so I think it's important that we address that, and I think that we probably have laws on the books that allow us to do that, but if we don't, that's one thing that I think we want to make sure that we do have the ability to go in and address the trash dumpster issue or the trash laying around. But I think my feelings diverge some from Councilmember Berry's points, in that in the conclusion, at least, we have population that varies in different parts of the city, and I think many of these businesses represent well the communities in which they're located. We have businesses that are we have low-income members of the community that go to these businesses, use their services, and we have businesses that are trying to build that cannot afford, business people who cannot afford to pay for a rental of a high-priced storefront as they're developing their business. And so I would like to see that we are able to accommodate those lower-end commercial businesses, but in a way that doesn't detract from the city. And I'm not sure that a pupusa truck detracts from the city at a gateway, and I think that Ethan Allen and New Hampshire is a gateway, just like Tacoma Langley Crossroads is. I don't think that a pupusa truck detracts from the gateway, because it is part of our population that's being served by that truck, and it is potentially a community member who is running a business at that location. But it needs to be clean and neat appearing and adhere to the codes.
Is there any basis to make distinctions between kinds of merchants For example, there are some kinds of things that clearly have to be sold outdoors. Christmas trees are a good example. They're sort of a seasonal item. I'm familiar with this merchant who sets up the Christmas trees stands at the Tacoma Langley Shopping Center, because I see him there every year, and he periodically has other things there also. And it seems to me that, you know, you can't really sell Christmas trees indoors, so those sort of have to be in somebody's parking lot. There's also like the pupusa wagons, you know, the kind of vending that they do and the kind of vending that other street corner food sellers do is fundamentally different from the kinds of things that merchants do with regular storefronts. But if I'm understanding, there's certain kinds of sales of things that are not different from the storefronts and might be really more appropriate in a storefront type thing, clothing and some of these other items. Is it possible to make distinctions between merchants on that kind of a basis?
No. Basically, they meet the zoning code. If they meet the zoning code in terms of the kinds of products or activities that they sell or the activities that they do, then they can do it inside or outside. And it's not, there's not a distinction that a pupusa restaurant is okay and a pupusa trailer isn't, or, you know, a variety of those kinds of things. It's the list of, the zoning code has a long list of certain allowable activities, and that's what they have to look at.
The other thing that might be added to that, which I think is not necessarily common sense, is that it can't be, the regulation can't be based on wanting to protect from competition the existing merchants. That has been struck down. It has to be for these other kind of police power types of reasons, not that you want to, because you have dry goods merchants in the shopping mall, you can't have a person selling competitive stuff outside.
Well, I wasn't thinking of that so much as I was thinking of the kinds of things that they sell. Presumably, well, for example, presumably if you're buying food, they have to meet health regulations, right? Whether they're selling from a pupusa wagon or from an inside location.
Right.
And when you buy a Christmas tree, you're buying, I mean, you can see what it looks like, and it's going to die in a few weeks anyway. But if you're purchasing something like clothing or shoes or something, and you wear your shoes for 2 days and they completely fall apart, if there's a storefront, at least you know who to go to, where if it's somebody who is selling on a Saturday and he disappears and you never see him again, you have no other recourse.
And maybe consumer protection is more like a police power type of thing, but Ms. Ledlow is right that if the zoning law says all of these kinds of uses are permitted, then we don't have the power to say, well, for us, only 2 of them and not the rest of them.
So if I can say where I think we are at this point, it sounds like the only kind of regulation that we can do that would fit within the kinds of concerns that we have is basically sort of economic, you know, revitalization kinds of things. Doug's point about, you know, creating a good atmosphere for, you know, a commercial area where the first thing somebody sees isn't necessarily a flea market when they drive into the commercial area, and do kinds of economic revitalization like that. Is that the case?
Right, and actually something like aesthetics is okay as long as it's in the service of the commercial revitalization. It just can't be by itself.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we have a real opportunity to have some discussions with the county on how to implement or tweak the CROZ zoning, the Commercial Revitalization Overlay Zone. That's the whole purpose of that zone, and it goes over all of our commercial districts in Tacoma Park. The purpose is to find ways to, you know, encourage revitalization and improve the aesthetics and the functioning of these areas. And this subject wasn't particularly addressed in that zone, but it doesn't mean that it can't be in the future, and it could be a good discussion to have. How it's actually structured will take some work, but I think that that's a way that protects our various gateways because they're all commercial areas, and but it also then ties it into that aesthetic issue that seems to be of most concern.
Okay. Sure.
People have already pointed to the 2 things that I think need to be stated about keeping the areas clean and complying with all of those aesthetic aspects, and then also making sure the gateways are kind of setting the tone that we would like to have here. So if the vendors could be encouraged to go to places probably not that far away from where they currently are, but where they can continue doing business, but not being right there at the gateway, that would satisfy me. And I would also, part of this brings up a discussion that we had with the city planners not that long ago, where we were asking them to encourage certain transient merchants in areas like Tacoma Junction. And I remember the PETA Plus wagon, I think it was called, that was very successful. And I believe it was before the Middle East cuisine had their restaurant. So they were both just takeout places. Now Middle East cuisine is, much more elaborate, but the issue is that it fit in to the Junction area. It was an added service to the people who shopped there. And when the city planners were before us not that long ago, we were talking about how the Junction also needs better utilization of the pavilion there. And there are tables and chairs, there's even a few parking spaces, and that would be a site that might help connect the two sides of or the three sides of the street, however you want to look at it, and in the warm months really bring some vitality to a commercial district we want to improve. So I want to make sure that, that I also voice my support for the variety of businesses we have, the culture of our community, and that this isn't about trying to curtail that. It is more about trying to beautify certain gateways and make sure that all merchants, transient or retail, are complying with the code that we have in our city.
And I would just add that the thing that I feel uncomfortable with this is the idea that we're somehow beautifying the city by eliminating one class of merchant. And I guess it goes back to, beauty's in the eye of the beholder, I guess.
Which is why the courts are very careful about aesthetics by itself. That it's got to be part of one of these other larger purposes.
And I just wanted to add that I think the issue of keeping an area free of trash isn't a zoning issue. It's something that should be done anyway. And I don't believe there's any exclusion from the, keeping an area clean and trash free, any exclusion for transient merchants. And so I think that's simply an enforcement issue, isn't it?
Yes.
Okay. Colleen.
The other.
Yeah, but if you grant a license and the property owner invites them onto the property and then they can't maintain that standard, and you can demonstrate a clear relationship between them not being able to maintain the standard and the onset of the permit, is that permissible?
No, that probably would be grounds for some kind of action against the permit.
Okay.
Permits are suspendable or terminatable.
So that might be something. Two other ideas. A residential buffer. There's a school buffer because if you within 500 feet or something of the school, you have to have the permission of the property owner, whether it's a private or a public school. Could you do that as a residential buffer based, particularly for the outdoor food issues based on noise, operating generators? A lot of those trucks have generators that they operate that are loud. And the other question about the Sligo Creek Parkway area, and that is there anything in the law for a view shed and preserving a view shed, kind of like we have the historic preservation model? Could we have some sort of a view shed preservation?
We don't have it yet.
What this brings up, which I wanted to say is a general point. So far, we've mainly focused on this idea of doing something with the cruise, the zoning area that we already now have for our commercial areas, and adding some additional requirements to that, which I think is a very hopeful direction. The other thing for you to all think about is what we can do under city law. Right now, really the only thing our current ordinance does is require the background checks of licensees. And we also get, we give a city license in addition to the county license that people are required to get. So it's a question of just thinking about what else we might want to add to our own municipal regulation beyond what the county already does. The county has a fairly comprehensive set of regulations, which is what primarily is what controls at this point. Your question about the residential distance, I'm checking. I think there's something in the county reg for that, but I don't remember by heart.
Could we put a requirement in the licensing thing that says that to maybe just go a step further on the issue that Colleen brought up, that if there is a problem with trash on the site, we don't have to prove that it's the vendor, that the vendor's license can be terminated if there's a trash problem on the site. We don't, in other words, we don't have to prove it's their fault. If there's a trash problem on the site, the presumption is that they're at least adding to it. And, if there's, however we define trash problem, so many complaints or whatever, and that we can just terminate the license without having to prove that it's the vendor's trash, which I don't know how you do unless everybody puts their name on their wrappers, which they don't.
Or isn't it the property owners?
Yeah, wouldn't you just find the property owner, and then very quickly the property owner would take care of their
that would be very nice.
No, I think you're misunderstanding. If you find the property owner and it's not a mess they made, it's their permit holder's mess, very quickly there will be some remedy.
No, we've had some property owners where, and I don't know whether it's been a vendor on the property, but we've had some property owners who have been, we've had to take them to court to get them to do things.
Aren't the fines like $500?
Whatever they are, they haven't been enough.
I know we raised them recently,
And
and certainly I've been hearing pain in the voice of people who have suffered from the new fees.
Bruce.
Just two quick observations on Colleen's point about the view shed. We don't have that. I know that there was something in the discussion in the master plan about the properties down along New Hampshire and the buffer from the stream, so that it may not be view shed, but in anything on a stream, there could be a restriction for how close anything could be. And I don't know whether that might take some of that same question. And the other thing was in discussing any thoughts about gateways, I would just remind us that the reason that we talk about gateways is that they tend to have a lot of traffic, and therefore thinking that a vendor might want to kind of back off a couple blocks from a gateway is not realistic.
Okay. Have we given you sort of helpful direction on this, or is there something specific else you need?
No, I think that's been helpful.
Just one question is, on this the concept of aesthetics, it appears in the memo that it mainly governs areas of history, historical areas, or certain kinds of architectural considerations. Can that also be extended to green space and wild areas like the creek area? Can that be conceived as an aesthetic area?
It's a good question. I've got it down.
Okay. And then the other point is, just to clarify, this is not about, discriminating or pushing certain kinds of businesses out of the area. I think what we're doing here is we're replacing a willy-nilly approach to business or economic development with a more thoughtful approach to the kinds of business development we'd like to see in certain parts of the area.
Anything else? Well, thank you, and I appreciate you bringing this to us for general discussion before we get into the specific code issues. And I know you're planning to bring it back to us when you've got some specific
I assume
ideas.
the next time we'll come back with some kind of report, both what the county is interested in and also what we can do ourselves.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And the final item on our agenda this evening is a proposal by the Police Department for the use of Homeland Security grant funds. Yes.
I guess this was some information that had come to us approximately a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, that the Montgomery County was going to be passing through some funding provided by the federal government to the municipalities within the county. They gave us a very short opportunity to provide some ideas for how we would spend the money, and the initial idea that we had for this amount is $14,629. Was to partially fund a canine for the purpose of explosive detection. It has come to my attention, I guess, during the budget process that there was some concerns over that project, and I just wanted to seek some feedback on that and find out whether there were issues relating to that proposed project that we could perhaps address to council, or float some other ideas for the possible spending of that money. We do have kind of a short time frame on this. It has to be spent by March of 2007 on this amount.
I have a couple of questions. One is on the fiscal impact. I noticed that your costed amount for an additional canine is roughly about almost $5,000 more than the amount of the grant funds, and that does not include the animal's food or veterinary costs. Right. Do we pay any other type, for example, when a canine is retired, do we pay additional money for the canine after that point?
I believe we don't have a whole lot of track record here. We only have
I think you have a one, yeah.
When we had the first canine, Credo, when he was retired, I believe we were paying some bills after he retired. The general practice in the industry is not to do that. Generally speaking, you would offer the dog to the handler for a nominal fee, and the city would wash its hands of the obligation to care for it after that.
But there are, it looks like there are significant costs over and above the grant funds.
I think that figure was a figure that we had obtained from a April of '05 quote from the vendor that we currently do business with. I confirmed with them this morning that the entire cost, including the modifications to the police vehicle, would be $17,750. On top of that, I looked at some of our expenditures over the last FY. Food for the 2 dogs that we have has been a little bit under $500 per dog for the year. Vet bills ran some variety, but routine vet bills for a healthy dog would be certainly less than $500 on a year. There would be some additional expenses. On some of our handlers, we've offered a home kennel. Usually you would want to have the ability to kennel the dog at home in a secure facility. We have one kennel that's not being used currently. It would need some modifications and a concrete pad port to make it useful. Don't have an exact figure on that, but we're probably talking about a couple $100 on that. So there is a little additional expenses. There would also be an additional expense for the in-service training that we provide the dog and the handler on the year, and that's estimated to be about $1,450 for a full year. If we brought this team on sometime between now and March, probably about a half-year expenditure there.
And the other question has to do with alternative uses of the funds. I'm looking at your list of possible alternative uses, and I'm noticing that replacement in-car computers, which is something that council's put a priority on, and the additional 800 megahertz portable radios, which is also something that would be very important for security purposes if there were an incident, that we had enough current and updated portable radios for communications purposes.
Yes. The problem with some of this money is that it's, the use for it's fairly narrow. It's called a Law Enforcement Terrorism Prevention Program. So most of the items that you purchase have to have some sort of nexus to preventing terrorism. One of those identified uses could be interoperable radio equipment. We used a previous similar grant for such equipment. The mobile computing is all interoperable with other agencies, so it is supported as well under the grant. Both of those items, from my standpoint, at this point on this grant, I don't see as any of these as bad ideas. 2 years ago, I thought that the canine a good idea. I'm concerned at this point with the time frame. 3 or 4 months is not a good amount of time to put this project together, but we still do have time if we choose to go that route. The other 2 ideas are certainly good ideas as well.
All right, are there other comments? Terry?
Yeah, I thank you for your candid response, evaluation of this, because I came here with a list of questions about the new canine dog, but then when I looked at the paperwork you've provided, it makes it clear we don't even need to discuss that tonight. You've got other ideas that not only are solid ideas, but they're things that we're going to have to buy anyways. So I think we ought to go ahead and commit the money from the grant for those expenses we're going to have, and not at this point incur additional annual costs by adding another canine dog.
Are there any additional council comments?
I would agree with that.
Bruce, and then I'll let you.
And I would agree with what Terry just said. I would just add that I can understand your desire to have something that increases your ability to attract and retain good officers, and that I can understand how the additional canine would be something that would do that. And when you're a small agency, coming up with those types of things to do just that can be more difficult. So I appreciate that could be your desire to do something like that, and would like to be in a position to support doing that to improve ability to recruit and retain. But I think we have to fund something like the mobile computer or the radios to just get fully up to speed on that.
Joy.
I would agree with what others have said. The one thing I notice is that the cross-training of, I believe we have 2 canines now, and we wouldn't want to cross-train them in too many ways. But the cross-training with the explosive detection ability, is that something that as we train future canines, that we would want to cycle in that added capability for the city?
It could be. By far the best specialty for a canine in a department this size would be narcotics. We've certainly come across more of that than we do likely explosive devices. I was intrigued, though, that one of the uses an explosive detecting dog can be used for is to detect ammunition, which would also be in conjunction with firearms trafficking. Kind of an unusual use. You don't hear about it that much, but almost the same way that you could have a dog, for instance, check a car for narcotics, you could potentially have a dog check a car for firearms or ammunition. So it's kind of a side use that I wasn't aware of before I did a little bit of research on this. I was very pleased to find out that it would be something that I thought we could get out of this type of dog with some frequency. I hope there aren't that many bombs here in Tacoma Park that we would be using it quite often for that.
They usually get dropped right here.
Absolutely.
My dog wouldn't help you with that one, Terry.
Okay, well, that to me seems like a good call for you to make about how you would like our 2 canines to be train.
Right.
And if that is an expanded capability that you think is a good idea, then that makes sense to me as well. And certainly firearms are very closely related to narcotics.
Yes.
So.
I don't rule it out in the future. I mean, potentially, if we were to use a grant like this to try to fund a future canine, it would have to be the explosive. The narcotics canine would not qualify for this grant.
Right.
And the other thing is that our current two dogs, dogs have a fairly limited work life, 5, maybe 6 years, usually good work time out of them. And we have one dog who's at that point that he will probably retire, I would say, within the next 2 years. So, this may come again next year or perhaps the year after, where we'll be talking about replacing that dog.
Okay, thank you.
I thought our first dog, and I remember he got an award for being trained in all 3 areas. He was tracking and explosives and narcotics, if I'm not mistaken.
There's 3 general areas that they train police dogs. Explosives is one area, narcotics is another, and then what I refer to as general patrol use. And that includes tracking suspects or tracking missing persons, doing building searches, doing article searches, that type of thing. It's usually considered that you can train most dogs in 2 areas, up to 2 areas. You would never want to train a dog in all 3 areas because that would be too confusing for the dog.
Because I thought he was.
They're not superhuman. So.
Well, I think that our canines have been very useful. And certainly, if you feel one of the canines is approaching retirement age, I would encourage you to make a proposal for replacement of that canine. But my sense is that of the things that could be purchased with this funding, I would put a higher priority on the communications equipment, including the in-car computers and the portable radios over the dog. And if I'm reading the council right, I'm sensing that that's the general sense on the council.
One thing that we've talked about in the past that is not in here, and I don't know if it qualifies under here, and that is the in-car video cameras. Would that be eligible under the Homeland Security grant?
I would have to look again at the specific, the controlling document on this is what's called the approved equipment list, and to see whether there would be a nexus for that. Probably not specifically for in-car videos, but some sort of remote video system there might be.
Because that is an officer's safety piece of equipment, and also helps to reduce liability of the city. And so that's something I would be interested in exploring if that's an alternative.
We have a couple other grants that we've already secured that we've earmarked for that general purpose, and the $14,600 amount is not a huge amount, and that is a fairly big ticket item. We have a much larger grant that we're looking at footing most of the bill for that project.
Okay, be interested to see that, if not at this time, at budget time, as that comes up later.
Yes, I just wanted to affirm the communications equipment, and I know we talked a little bit about the Blue Phone idea, and you indicated that that would not be something these funds could cover. If you could just confirm that before you come back to us, or actually, will this be coming back to us? Because they're all under 5,000?
No, I think that it would have to come back to us for at the
Well,
point
for
at which
awarding
it's
a
purchased.
contract, right? Would we?
I guess
Generally,
specifically which of these ideas that we do, it might or might not have to come.
Okay. I think if it's over a certain limit, and I believe
10,000, I think.
Yeah, it is the 10,000. And since presumably you're purchasing 14,000, but you could buy some of each. And
right.
But there would have to be a budget amendment.
yes, there would have to be a budget amendment accepting the grant funds, because I don't think they're currently in the budget.
I think they are.
They
I
are?
think that was because that's
how
why
it
we
came
had
up
this
before.
discussion at
Right.
budget time.
That's right.
That's how it came up.
So my only point was that I would appreciate information on other sources of funding for those Blue Phones. This may or may not come back to us, but if you could make sure that that is
You mean
forthcoming,
the
because
Blue Phones, you mean the ones with,
Right, the
for
emergency
pedestrian
call.
use and
Mhm.
stuff, yeah.
It's something that we still have these 4 outdated ones. They are not used. For the most part, they're not even seen. And I believe it was 2 years ago that Wolfgang Mergner of the Public Safety Committee, Andy Kellerman, came to us. They asked for those to be replaced. We weren't comfortable taking them down without putting new ones in place. I think that is a capital expenditure that would contribute to our ability to do community policing, and it would give the Orange Hat patrols a way to. They like to go around and check them out. Also, I know the 4 phones that we have are all in Ward 1. I believe there might be one on the border with Ward 3, but we're talking about looking at making that a little bit more representative of the whole community, so that those phones were a resource throughout our community. North Tacoma, Penn, Waco, all of those neighborhoods are ones that should be attended to, that are quite close to the metro. And I haven't seen any funding sources for that, but probably you will see more than I will, and I would just appreciate if that isn't lost sight of.
I'll certainly look into that. I don't believe I could find a nexus for the law enforcement terrorism prevention program, but there may be other funding sources we can.
And just
Thank you.
to answer, I think you were looking for maybe some guidance on the alternatives here. I think I would certainly support as a number 1 priority the additional 800 megahertz portable radios as the top priority of these, with the replacement in-car computers following second, but a distant second, since we haven't had all of those operational over the last year anyway. So.
Yeah, we are doing our best to get those in place. Of the original 10 that we were supposed to have imaged by the county, we found that 4 of them are so old that they won't support the software. So actually,
I guess my point is that wasn't a priority within the department, so I think the priority should be for this grant, the radios, upgrading those.
Well, I would be happy with either of those myself.
And what will the radios be used for?
We had just floated the idea of the radios when we originally purchased the 800 megahertz radios about 6 years ago. We bought just enough for one for every full-time person in the department. As time progresses, of course, things get broken or otherwise wear out, and there's been no budget to replace those. And certainly we wouldn't have anticipated that. We expect them to have a lifetime of about 10 years unless they get damaged. Well, things do get damaged, and replacing isn't easy.
Yeah, the communications equipment seems like the most critical to me as well, and I'm satisfied that either the radios or the in-car computers are the things that need the money.
Okay. If there's nothing else, thank you. We appreciate you bringing your thoughts to us.
Sure.
If there's nothing else, we're adjourned.
And go vote.
Yep, everybody don't forget to vote.
Yeah, that's right. Go to the rec center and vote now.